Is there anything more dangerous to the world than an individual who believes in their own righteousness, believes that they have been chosen by God? For then is there anything that they would not do? So it was in the deserts of New Mexico, whereupon a man found himself alone and in despair. Desperate, he turned to faith, to the great television and radio evangelists, and found in their sermon no hope. Yet in his despondence, did he hear from the static a voice? Perhaps distorted, no, not distorted, but the word of God, or at least that is what this man, Sullivan Knoth, thought. A voice that spoke of its dissatisfaction with the world, with the corruption of its teachings, and the need for a brave new prophet. And upon that night, he was visited by an angelic creature that bore a prophecy that showed the end of days would occur within his lifetime, and that Knoth would lead a chosen few into paradise, saving them from eternal damnation. Driven by this newfound purpose, Knoth abandoned his worldly possessions, spending his days preaching upon the streets of Albuquerque. With time, his passion drew others who were lost or disaffected, and as his flock grew, each donated their material possessions to the newly formed church, the testament of the new Ezekiel. And with this newfound wealth, the church purchased a ranch and lived communally. Knoth continued to be guided on by the words and messages of the voice, recording them for posterity in a book of verses, the Gospel of Knoth. Disappointed by the relatively slow growth of his flock, he encouraged women and men to breed frequently, and personally saw to delivering of each child. Little did Knoth or his followers know that this little act would be what brought them low. Warrant in hand, New Mexico State Police descended upon the ranch, arresting dozens, citing health and safety violations. Knoth and a handful of his followers escaped into the night. The church's assets were seized, and all of Knoth's work hung in the balance, in serious danger of falling apart. And so Knoth followed the example of Moses and Abraham before him, ascending a mountain alone so that he may commune with God. There he waited until the word of God commanded that he sacrifice an eye, so that he may truly see. And while the blood pooled at his feet, he saw with what he believed to be absolute certainty that which would become of his church. He foresaw a town, far into the wilderness and hidden away from the corruptions of civilization. He saw his town as the gateway to his true temple, and so he called this town Temple Gate, and there he saw his followers preparing for the tribulations of the end times. This he shared with his flock, warning that the path ahead would be arduous and the pains many, that each would be tested and ultimately forced to make difficult sacrifices and to be faced with impossible choices, so that they may achieve everlasting paradise. And so, on that day, they ventured forth into the desert, all in the hopes of leaving the wickedness of the world behind. 2 years later, in 1971, they would reach the town of his vision. There he pushed out the native tribes, and here, for a time, the church would find peace, establishing a largely self-sufficient community, purchasing and raising their own livestock, building their schools and power generators. And from then on, they rarely ventured off into the outside world. Yet, this would not be the end of the world's influence upon them, for as they lived in this new town, large flashes of light would burst forth from the horizon. and with them would hearken the publication of the new Gospels of Knoth. Herein, Knoth's message became increasingly unhinged, always somewhat vulgar in message and tone. It promulgated rape, incest, and murder, and they became commonplace. The sharing of partners saw to widespread sexually transmitted infections, and those who were found to be riddled with such afflictions were cast from the community into the surrounding wilderness, Knoth condemning them for having a tainted soul that was made manifest in the flesh. Though somewhat hypocritically, he seemed to send forth messengers of the flock to secure for himself access to penicillin. Yet hypocrisy was not the greatest of their evils. That would come about sometime later, with a widespread practice of infanticide, a practice which arose from visions and from the fear that the Antichrist would be born of their community. In this bloodshed, the community was further broken. Many were beset by visions of other times and other places, hunted by the sins of their past, and found that their already crumbling mental state collapsed into fanatical belief. For if Knoth did not speak the word of God, how could they cope with what they had done? Others, driven by their own grief and anger, ended their lives, and still others broke with Knoth, entirely condemning his message, their anger and pain given over to hedonism, motivated by their own innate pleasures. They fled into the old and abandoned mining tunnels. Over the coming years, few would move beyond the community, and fewer still would find focus in maintaining it. The grounds were littered with corpses, and that community beset by disrepair. The church, always the heart of the faith, still stood, but not only as a place of worship, but a prison for the heretics and the enemies of their faith. Their livestock were butchered and left to rot. And when two outsiders descended upon the community, they were met with anger and hostility, condemned to death and viewed as the bearers of the Antichrist. When they escaped into the night, the church would hunt them relentlessly, growing more and more fearful as the night wore on, dreading that the Antichrist would be born. When they learned that the outsider had been found amongst the heretics in the mines, the faithful waged war on the heretics. And by dawn, the church, the heretics, and Knoth were all dead, each standing testament to the dangers of a blind and unquestioning faith, and equally so of social isolation and the havoc it may play upon the mind.